All right, so I spoke a bit about some of the reasons why the Quebec Charter of Values that's proposed is in a way a pandering by the Parti Québécois to their geographical electoral base, the base of their geographical support based on the last election results. So talking about that, so now I'd like to talk a little bit about the second topic, which is some of the historical trends which led to Quebecers having a much more negative view overall of religion than in the rest of Canada. In particular time period I wanted to talk about is the Quiet Revolution, which was a name given to a period of very rapid change that took place in the 60s, 1960s. But before I do that, it's necessary to kind of go back farther to look at a few points of the prior history and the decades that led up to the 1960s to get a sense of the motivation behind the explosive change that took place during that period. So I mean, one point, first of all, before anything, to point out is that in terms of religious heritage, Quebec, because of its French background, differs from much of English Canada in that France was a predominantly Catholic country, England predominantly Protestant country, so the religious heritage in Quebec was Roman Catholic as compared to predominantly in the rest of Canada, with some exceptions being the English-speaking Irish settlers. But for the most part, the rest of Canada is more Protestant, and Quebec traditionally had Roman Catholic heritage. So with that mentioned, I want to paint a bit of a picture of the state of Quebec, and particularly French-Canadian Quebec, in the decades leading up to the 1960s. So for the period in the decades before the 1960s are referred to by historians of Quebec as the Duplessis Era. And it's named that after a politician by the name of Maurice Duplessis, who was the Quebec premier for 18 years, 18 of the years between the period from 1936 to 1959. He was premier from 1936 to 1939. He had a bit of a break when another party was in power from 39 to 45. And then he was premier from 1945 up until 1959, when he went out of office only because he died. So for 18 out of 23 years, he was the premier. And he was a conservative premier. And he ruled over Quebec over a very socially and economically conservative period in Quebec. Some historians today afterwards tend to be very critical of that period. They called it Le Grand Noirceur, the Great Darkness, because some of the effects of some of the policies of that period. So what did it look like in that period? For the French-Canadian population, there was very widespread poverty. There was no provincial organization of education or of healthcare or social services. All of these sort of social services were provided through religious institutions, through for the French, through the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church did the education, they provided the healthcare, they provided the social welfare services. There's no provincial organization for that. And as well, there were no, because of that, there was not a lot of organization of standards of education. There were thousands of different over 1,000 different boards with different standards and criteria and qualifications and certifications. And education was not free at that point. Up to the 1960s, Quebec didn't have a uniform free public education. So particularly in the French sector, this led to very low levels of education. I read figures of this period, something like only 13% of the French Canadians would graduate from high school, as compared to about 35% in the rest of Canada. Almost no French Canadians at that time were going to university, and so of course there was almost no representation in the prestigious white collar fields like medicine, dentistry, lawyers, and so on. Most of the big corporations, the management, the bosses, the managers, the CEOs and such, the boards were English. There's widespread poverty amongst the French Canadians as well. The province didn't pursue under sort of economically conservative policies. The government didn't pursue much control over the natural resources. The companies exploiting the mineral resources and such were foreign companies mostly, and the resources were sold off very cheap. And Quebec didn't have much control over that. Another part of the policy was that because of the communist scare of the time, remember this was from the 1930s to through to the 1950s, which is a very conservative time even in the United States. Big thing was the communist fear, and so as part and parcel of that, the Duplessis administration tended to crack down very hard on labor organizing and on efforts for unionization. So these sort of elements progressed a lot more slowly in Quebec than they did in the rest of Canada. And overall, across the board in Quebec, the rate of economic growth was very slow. The levels of prosperity were very low. It was almost like at the start of the 1960s, Quebec, at least in terms of the French portion of the population, was almost a third world country situated in the middle of Canada, a first world country. The disparities in development were that bad. So, and there was kind of a conservative arrangement between the powers that be, with Duplessis and the government, and business establishment on his side, and the church, where they would mutually support each other. They were in a mutually kind of supportive relationship. The church would encourage people to support the government, and the government would give the church control over certain things and over a lot of the social issues like education and social services. So Duplessis died in 1959, and kind of a dam broke at that point. A lot of kind of built up tension and pressure for change was kind of released at that point. There was an election in 1960. The Liberal Party, led by a man named Jean Lesage, swept into power under slogans like "Il faut que ça change," something has to change, and "Maître chez nous," the masters of our own house. So this was the kind of the thinking at that time. So they swept into power, and the period from 1960 to 1970 was a period of incredibly rapid change and incredibly rapid social change and incredibly rapid economic development. Some of the changes that happened: the province took control of education, formed the Provincial Ministry of Education. The province took control of social services and health services, formed the Ministry of Health and Social Services. In 1962, Quebec undertook the project of nationalization of electricity production. That was where Hydro-Quebec came from. That project was led by a young Liberal MP by the name of Ray Levesque, who became famous, very famous in Quebec politics much later, or about a decade and a half later, as the first Parti Québécois premier in 1976. What else? Formation of public companies for control and exploitation of natural resources, development of finance agencies to channel funds towards development of economic projects, economic infrastructure projects, the building of many of the big power dams for power generation for Hydro-Quebec, the development of the Quebec pension plan, the development of the Caisse de dépôt, and more relaxed labor codes that were more positive towards union organization. Some might argue that afterwards that might have gotten out of hand at a certain point, but at that point it was probably a justified movement. So a lot of changes came out with that, and this was mixed in with the general social changes that were taking place in the 1960s in the rest of Canada, in the United States, in Europe at that time. Very big period of change, and it's kind of like a matter of if you press a spring spring very tight, it's going to spring back harder. The pendulum is going to swing back very far in the opposite way. So that's a large extent what happened in Quebec. Quebec developed economically hugely over that period, and Quebecers were very proud of that, rightly so. And because of that, this is a large part of the reason why they tend to look back negatively on religion in general, because it was, in their case, part of a system of multiple parts that was keeping it down for a long time. The alliance between the Catholic Church on one side and the government allied with certain business interests on the other side. So as a result, I mean, they're very suspicious of religion today, more than the English Canadians who didn't go through the same sort of experience are. So this explains quite a bit the differences in attitudes between English Canadians and French Canadians as to towards religion. Whereas in English Canada, while a lot of people are not very practicing religiously, they tend to take a live and let live attitude. For the French Canadians, because of all this historical baggage, for them, religion is something that worked hand in hand with forces that were holding them down, and as something that they had to strive hard to overcome, to try to have self-determination and dignity for their lives. So it's much more of a serious, heavy kind of historical baggage there. Active power of religion in society and in a position of influence is something that they felt that they've gone beyond, that they overcame, that they got beyond, and so they're very wary about even the slightest hints of it popping up and regrowing in the public sphere. So that's about all I have to say for that. And hopefully this cleared up, or hopefully this makes some of these things a little bit clearer. I encourage you to search on the internet and to read more. I'm going to include a couple of basic links in the description. And if you have any questions, any comments, please feel free to write them below, and look forward to continuing the discussion. All right, thanks, and have a good day.